Ladies and gentlemen, Alice Walker.
Thank you. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here. Veterans for Peace is one of my favorite organizations on the planet. I think it is incredibly brave and has wonderful vision about the impossibility of continuing the war games that we all know so well. Time is actually running out for that. I was thinking about coming here for the last several months, and then on Monday, because I was waiting to know what I wanted to say to you, I wrote this for tonight. It starts with a poem that is situated in the cemetery in Ward's Chapel, Putnam County, Georgia. In this cemetery are all of my ancestors and relatives who have died over the last 100 years or so. I think the oldest person there, the oldest grave there now that we've moved it there, was of my grandmother, Sally, who died in 1831. So I want to read this to you, and I regret in a way reading it because I like so much looking at you. But I also know that listening to reading can be very soothing and very good for you. So if you want to close your eyes, please do so. And this is called Stay With Us. Stay With Us. Thoughts about war, and it is dedicated to the other veterans for peace. You know who the other veterans for peace are? They're the ones who are taking their own lives. Those are the veterans for peace who are not here. So we pay a visit to those who play at being dead. This is in the Ward's Chapel, little tiny church at the bend of a road in Georgia, middle Georgia. Very beautiful, but one of the things that happened to that church was that you have to just call them white people, actually. They just ran a road right through our front yard of that church, destroying what had been the center of our community and actually separating the church from the cemetery. I mean, this is typical. This is typical behavior that all of us grew up with, the feeling of not being seen, not being wanted. Nobody cares where you worship. Nobody cares what happens to your school. They burned down the first one that my parents and the community built. So these were the people that we were surrounded by in Georgia. And yet, community, because of the absolute truth that love is strong, continues even when people die. And that is something that it has been left to some of us to remember and to affirm, that you may in fact die, but you still live for those of us who care. So we pay a visit to those who play at being dead. My mother, for instance, whose cheekbones greet me from a recent photograph of myself. My father, those eyes in the mirror I would recognize anywhere. My brother's tree that he planted years before he planted himself is awash in light that robustly proclaims his vivid, if persistently mysterious, presence. My grandparents, Henry and Rachel, whose voices are perpetually murmuring sweet nothings in my heart. Look, I say to all of them, the cousins and the outside children too, because all of my brothers actually had outside children, I have brought friends. We sit content and munch our veggie salad and forbidden potato chips sitting serene amongst your graves, sitting serene amongst your graves. You are silent. A granddaughter, my niece, who cares that your graves are kept clean as she has always known them, lowers her shapely form to rest on an Army veteran's tombstone. So many of you, I had not noticed this before, went off to fight strangers, returning wounded, dead, or strangers yourselves. You are quiet too, as we sit munching our lunch. But are you really dead? Are you really dead? Are you not perhaps the reason I have no enthusiasm, patience, or admiration for war? You, the poor, dispossessed cannon fodder, safer behind the mule you left than behind any gun. My friend Pratibha, her name means genius in her original language, which is Hindi, brown Indian British with an accent that would have made you laugh, as your own southern country accent amused many, films us all sitting, talking, eating, laughing, being with you as you play dead. Later, in the van, leaving your place of enchanted rest, we marveled at who life has put into our vehicle. Old friends by now, really because of you. There is no other explanation, though you may continue your little afterlife game of playing dead. The recent cover of Time magazine tells an unusually sad and tragic story. One a day. The number of soldiers who commit suicide while they are in the American military operations in Afghanistan and Iraq. Having suffered from suicidal depression for many years when I was younger, I am immediately saddened by the thought of the last hours of all these sons and daughters, grandsons and granddaughters of ours. In fact, anyone who has ever suffered from suicidal depression understands that the painful tension of it is almost unbearable, and that the thought of suicide actually begins to beckon the sufferer, who almost starts to long for oblivion, considering it to be at last, an opportunity to rest, to find peace. The headstones of soldiers in my family's section of the Ward's Chapel Cemetery in Putnam County, Georgia, tell the ending of a story our local people knew little about. The young men drafted out of the cotton fields of Georgia had no idea whatsoever of where they were being sent. No idea whatsoever of where they were being sent, nor did they have a clue, not a clue, whom they were required to fight. In the First World War, they were forbidden to actually harm any white person, no matter that they were considered the enemy. Their job was to build latrines and keep them clean, to pick up the wounded and dying, to wash and iron the real soldiers' uniforms, and to obey any order given by a white person, whether on the U.S. side or not. This was demanded by the racism of the time. So these men who died and were buried in these graves near our church were returned to us in pieces, some of them, to people who knew nothing, 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 nothing of their blind sacrifice. Others who returned from both the First World War and the Second World War with physical injuries or mental disorders usually sat mute and despondent days and weeks and months, days and weeks and months, days, weeks, months, years and decades, 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 decades on end, with no one in the community they left behind even remotely aware, remotely aware of what they had endured. Remotely, not remotely. Where the hell is France? What is it? Do they have mules over there? My own brothers were soldiers in the Korean War. They too came home mute about their experiences, because what could they tell us, country people, who had rarely left our small communities? What could they tell us? We'd never gone anywhere. Peace-loving people whose deep spirituality made any kind of violence a disgrace to the Prince of Peace. The Prince of Peace our people followed in church, whose turn the other cheek directive was ever striven for, and whose teachings of love and kindness, were deeply believed. And so when I think of the mostly young men who are killing themselves in the military today, I think of the veterans of the First and Second World Wars who were my great uncles and distant cousins, and also of my brothers, who might have committed suicide, except their anger and self-loathing at whatever had been done to them, induction, racist humiliation during basic training and after, the training to kill people of color that would have reminded them of themselves, their mothers, their fathers, their grandparents, their children. That anger was turned outward toward family and society. In fact, their rage turned homicidal rather than suicidal. And that too is part of the tragedy of war. I have been thinking of something I always say to young people who tell me that they are suicidal, and so many of our young people are suicidal. I tell them, wait until morning. I say this based on my own experience of toughing it out through many a grim night to see the beauty once more of the morning sky, to hear birds chirping outside my window, to witness the miracle of dawn and the soft movement of fog, of rain, of wind, of leaves falling. And yet, what if I had been forced to do something unimaginably horrible? What if I discovered I had been fooled? What if I discovered I had been fooled? Made a fool of, lied to, egregiously. What if I had witnessed and participated in cruelties and abuses that defied anything I'd been led to expect of other human beings or of myself? What if I felt I had been used so despicably, I could never look into my own eyes again? What if the war into which I had perhaps enlisted, turned out to be not really a war, because most of those on the other side had no weapons, but more of a mass murder of poor people, people whose minimal clothing, food, and shelter could not be hidden from me, as I destroyed them? What if I remained human, having done inhuman things? What if I remained human, having done inhuman things? What if I still had a conscience? What if I still had one? Dead men love war. Dead men love war. They sit astride the icy bones of their slaughtered horses, grinning. They sit astride the icy bones of their slaughtered horses, grinning. They wind their pacemakers especially tight, and like Napoleon, who was always very far from the battlefield, actually, I don't know if you know that, they wind their pacemakers especially tight, and like Napoleon, favor green velvet dressing gowns on the battlefield. They sit in boardrooms dreaming of a prophet that outlives death. Dead men love war. They like to anticipate receptions and balls to which they will bring their loathsome daughters, desolation and decay. They like to fantasize about the rare vintage of blood to be served, and how much company they are going to have. I believe our young soldiers are killing themselves because their humanity is still alive. They do not want to become the dead men who are giving the orders. Something human is still alive in them, and they want it to stay that way. After all, though much of the world now thinks of Americans as killers and terrorists, we know this is not a true picture, not at all, nor has it ever been. We know that the vast majority of young people who leave their homes, their wives and husbands and young children to go off to fight in a war do it for the same reasons other people in all lands have done it, to make a living doing something they have been told is useful on their way to making for themselves, their families, and their communities a life. They have not been raised to be killers. Thousands of feet below you, there is a small boy running from your bombs. If he were to show up at your mother's house on a green sea island off the coast of Georgia, he'd be invited in to dinner. Now, driven, you have shattered his bones. He lies steaming in the desert in 50 or 60 or maybe 100 oily, slimy bits. If you survive and return to your island home and your mother's gracious table, where the cup of loving kindness overflows the brim and from which no one in memory was ever turned, gather yourself, set a place for him. What to do with the you? What to do with the you that continues to live inside? no matter what you have done. What to do with the you that continues to live inside no matter what you have done. One of the best friends I made, having left home at 17, was the great historian activist Howard Zinn. It was at, yes, presente. Thank you. It was at the height of the civil rights movement in the South. And Howard Zinn, unlike other history professors in schools around Atlanta, Georgia, was out on the street protesting, picketing, being assaulted and arrested along with his students. We were attempting to bring down American apartheid. It was simply astonishing to witness this because, among other reasons, Howard was white. At the same time, he was militantly against the Vietnam War. In the streets against this atrocity also went Howard. Long after he had left the South, Howard continued his anti-war work, leading marches, speaking at rallies, endlessly teaching the truth of what he knew about war. At one point, going to Hanoi and bringing some of our soldiers, prisoners of war, home. He used to tell us, his students at Spelman College in Atlanta, a school for mostly middle-class young women of color, that during the Second World War, he had been a bombardier. I could never associate the dropping of bombs with Howie, as he was affectionately called by the many who loved him, because he was so kind, so thoughtful, so patient with his students, and so utterly devoted to nonviolence. This was the Howie who lived within the person who dropped bombs that killed countless people. His very last book, The Bomb, written shortly before he died, is about this. Howard Zinn grew up in the slums of Brooklyn in a poor family, though they didn't know they were poor because, like my own poor family in Georgia, there was always plenty to eat. He joined the Army, and because of his exceptionally good eyesight, was trained as a bombardier. He carried out many missions on the Allied side against the Germans during the war. The one that stuck in his mind, though, was the last sortie, when just a week or two before the war's ending, his squadron of flyers was ordered to drop bombs on a small seaside village in France, Royan, a favorite vacation spot of Picasso. Because it was thought some Germans were hiding there, this was done. The bombs were dropped using a new kind of jellied gasoline, and this turned out to be the very first use of napalm. The village and most of its inhabitants were killed. The whole area became an inferno barely seen by those high above in the airplanes. Howard speaks candidly and honestly about how disconnected he was from the damage being done below. How, on being told their last mission would be to continue to fight in Japan, he had actually felt happy to learn bombs had already been dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, because that meant he would be able to go home and not have to fight anymore. The horror of that catastrophe was not brought fully into his consciousness until a journalist went to witness the devastation, took photographs, and wrote stories about some of the severely maimed survivors. Howard Zinn is someone who should never have been required to go to war, never required to drop bombs on anyone, never been required to kill. but he was, and he did kill. And it is his life story that I wish to offer would-be suicides in America's armies. Once out of the service, as this lethal employment is euphemistically called, Howard Zinn was able on the GI Bill to go to college, then to graduate school. He was able to learn about whatever was of interest to him, which was what he most wanted in his heart to do. He was able to get degrees that enabled him to teach others, and what he chose to teach others was a lot of what he'd learned himself. About the sociopathic power of the bosses and so-called leaders of the world, the sociopathic power of the bosses and so-called leaders of the world, the heavy investment by the wealthy in the slaughter of everybody's young, men who believe it is their right to manufacture wars to advance their avarice, and about the effort and constant struggle the soul must undergo in order not to lose what is most precious, not to lose what is most precious. The original meaning of one's life that is embedded in the original self. The original meaning of one's life that is embedded in the original self. The meaning each of us presents to the rest of humanity as our unique gift. Howard Zinn wrote a people's history of the United States because he had discovered the lies of patriotism and God's on our sideism that had caused him to destroy countless women, men, children, old people, animals, houses, and rivers without ever thinking very deeply about it, until it was too late for those who were gone and too late for him to undo what he had unwittingly done. He marched with the poor, the students, people of color, women, because he could see from his own experience how we are pitted against each other in a fake war that benefits us not at all, but is used as a distraction from the machinations of those who steal life, land, and liberty from all of us. I say today to every young person in the military who has done or has witnessed evil, or who has suffered evil done to him or herself, wait until morning and read Howard Zinn. When I was preparing this talk, I myself read, via audio, 2 great books on war that I highly recommend. War and Peace, though you should skip the ending where Tolstoy, and I hadn't remembered this from college, gets bogged down in farming techniques. And a truly exceptionally extraordinary contemporary book by Adam Hochschild, To End All Wars, which is about the First World War. This is the best book I've ever read about war. In both these books, what is striking is how little wars have changed. How many innocent people, including innocent soldiers, die for reasons they cannot fathom, and how it is primarily the foot soldiers, the privates, who are deemed supremely expendable, of negligible consequence. I also watched Steven Spielberg's recent movie, War Horse, a film that shows the little fish as the poor cannon fodder soldiers are seen by the military machine, caught in the meshes of violent confrontations, that it is impossible, because of limited education and experience, to comprehend. The madness of war the madness of war is given mute testimony by our young men and some young women who take their own lives rather than continue to murder others or to self-murder in slow motion while feeling half alive. My heart is moved for them. Like Howard Zinn, they might find so many battles out here to join, on our streets and inside our ravaged forests and within our dying oceans, our decapitated mountains, life and death battles beyond the battlefield. We need them beside us with all that they have learned, with all their valor and expertise, their lack of a fear of dying, which can be a very good thing. Stay with us, I say to them, stay with us. We desperately need you. And wait until morning. Dear ones, beloved ones, just wait. Stay here to witness along with us your own internal sun, as it shines again.